So based on a quote from Sandy Powell, there are 5 to 6 layers in this outer skirt. So we know that there are different colors were used, and the ones mentioned are green, blue, lavender, lilac, and silvery color. Plus we know that there's also the nylon iridescent layer. So personally, I don't think that all those colors mentioned are on top of that iridescent nylon layer. You can very clearly see that nylon layer, and there's not a lot of color on top of it except for a shimmery purpley teal blue color. So after not believing that all those aforementioned colors are on top of that nylon layer, I found another article where Sandy says there are 3 layers to the outer skirt: a lilac, a greeny blue, and a cornflower blue. Which this all adds up and makes sense because as I was analyzing pictures of the skirt, it did look like those are the 3 colors that are on top of the shiny iridescent layer. So we've been told that the outermost layer of the skirt is blue and is made of silk crepeline. Now let's look at 2 other layers that are right below this top layer, but on top of the nylon layer. So we've got the nylon layer, we've got 2 other layers, which we'll talk about in just a minute, and the top layer of silk crepeline. So in this particular photo, you can see that underlayer poking out from the outermost layer. It looks to be like a aqua-ish teal blue, which would make sense with the quote that I just mentioned that Sandy Powell said a greenish blue. So that would be the underlayer. And then there's another layer you seem to be peeking out on top of the nylon layer under the silk crepeline layer, and it looks to be a lilac-y purple. So that all adds up and makes sense. Now, for the material of those 2 other layers, so we've got the iridescent layer, and then we've got 2 other layers, the greeny teal one and the purple one, and then we've got the outer silk crepeline. So those 2 fabrics underneath do have a name. They're called this name quite often. It's this word. Pronunciation I can't find, but I'm guessing it's something like YUMISSIMA. I really don't know, but it's a fabric that if you Google, there's only a few pictures that come up. Some involve the Cinderella picture because they say that's what was used, and then another one is the Into the Woods dress. And another thing that always comes up are these gorgeous pictures. They're just kind of gorgeous, and I want to get my hands on that fabric. But they do mention that it's very expensive, like incredibly expensive per yard. So seeing as there's 2 layers in this skirt, that would be very expensive, and you can't find it anywhere. But these pictures come up under the name Jacob Scalifer. Hope I'm pronouncing that right, but they come up under that name. And if you look up on his website, a page comes up with this picture, and the description is Jacob Scalifer's creations, Yuma and YUMISSIMA, are both to be seen on the big screen for the movies Cinderella and Into the Wood. These super light fabrics have been made into romantic princess gowns. So we definitely know that this person created the fabric for Cinderella's ball gown. He does have fabric listed on his website, but unfortunately there is no YUMISSIMA listed on his website, though it's probably actually a good thing because if I knew it was available, I would be tempted to buy it for this project, and that would be really bad. Awful, because it would be so expensive, but I would be tempted to do it. So it's probably a good thing that he doesn't have any of the fabric listed online. But anyway, it's a fabric you really can't find. But so I just said that it's probably a good thing that I can't find the fabric anywhere. Turns out I can. Really bad. But anyway, I was Googling more options for this fabric, just any words that might describe a really lightweight organza, something like that. That's what I was going for. And suddenly this photo popped up and I clicked on it, and unfortunately it didn't lead me to any listing or anything, but this company talks about creating an extremely lightweight fabric. Now they mentioned that it weighs this much, and that sounded incredibly light, and they talked about it, how it floats, it's incredible. I mean, it was perfect, but it turns out it's pretty much the same as YUMISSIMA, as in price. And you can't find it anywhere either. And then as I was Googling this term more and more, super organza is what they called it, it seemed to come up a couple times in combination with YUMISSIMA. So I actually used the contact form on the Jacob, can't remember his last name, website and asked them, do you have this available or whatever? And they actually responded and they said, we do not have this anymore. We don't have the base fabric, so we can't create any more. So when I discovered this super organza made in Japan that looked exactly like YUMISSIMA, I still don't know how that is said, but anyway, when I heard that they didn't have the base fabric, and then that there's this other company that has a very similar looking fabric, I kind of got thinking that maybe the base fabric of YUMISSIMA is this super organza made in Japan. So that might seem like it helped a little bit, but it really didn't, because you can't find the super organza anywhere anyways. But to my demise, a random picture came up on Google as I was searching. I clicked on it and it led me to bnjfabrics.com, where I Googled organza, thinking standard organza would come up, right? No. What came up was a fabric that is called ultra sheer organza onion skin. I'm not sure where that comes from, but looking at the pictures, this second picture shows a layer of the fabric on top of a hand. You can't even tell it's there. So at first glance, it's $130 a yard. That's crazy, right? But it's available. This type of fabric is available. But they also sell a non-iridescent same type of fabric. So it just doesn't have iridescence in it, but it's still just as sheer, which is still expensive. It's $80 a yard. But that's pretty bad, because I'm tempted, but that would be really expensive. So as of right now, I'm saying no, and I'm hoping that I find another alternative for it. But this is where you guys come in. If you have ever thought about becoming a patron, or purchasing some of my patterns, or purchasing some of my swag items, now would be the time to do it, because I would take that as incentive to make the leap and buy the fabric. I said it. If enough of you guys do one of those three things, and there's no way it's going to amount to what I would have to spend to buy this fabric, but if enough of that happened, then I would probably take the leap. Kind of crazy. But this dress is kind of a once in a lifetime. I mean, I've made other ones, but this is the one that I'm going to combine all the different techniques and not leave anything out. So if you guys wanted to make me make that crazy decision, all the links for those three things are down below. As of right now, if that doesn't really happen, then I'm gonna say no, and there's a possible second option. It could be just as good, but I haven't received a price quote on it. But I'm guessing it's gonna be about the same price range as this other stuff that I found. I don't know if I should encourage you to do one of those three things, because that means I would spend a lot of money. But at the same time, it'd be really crazy. So far we have the top layer of silk crepe line, 2 layers of YUMISSIMA, and then the iridescent nylon layer. Now underneath that, it appears to be 1 or 2 other layers of a white material. I don't know what type of fabric this is, but if we look at these photos here, you see it kind of flipping up underneath the nylon layer, and it almost looks like frills in some of the pictures, but really looking closely at it, it doesn't look like frills. It looks like a skirt layer. And so this would actually make sense and connect with Sandy Powell's comment about 5 to 6 layers to the outer skirt. So far we have 4 layers, And then if there was 1 or 2 more layers underneath the iridescent layer of this white material, that would account for the other 1 or 2 layers. So anyway, there are a few details of the skirt that we need to explore. So first of all, looking at some of these pictures, we see a seam to the outer layer of the skirt. It looks to be sewn with a metallic thread, and it looks like a serged type stitch. It's a pretty small seam, I would guess only about an 1/8 inch, but it does look like a serged stitch. And then if we look at this photo, there's a really unique detail that you might notice under the top layer. You see a line of tiny little gems going up the skirt, like a full little line. And then looking close at the promotional photo, again we see a little sparkly line going up the skirt. Super interesting and also super intimidating craziness, because I think it actually is the seam for that underlayer, and it's a line of tiny little gems evenly spaced all the way up that seam. So really, this dress never surprises me when I see something and I think, how much time did that take to do that? It's probably true, like it probably was used in the dress, because this dress is just phenomenal and took so much time. So anyway, that's a little detail that I have not added in any of my replicas yet, but it will probably happen in this replica. So if we now look at the hems of this skirt, the outer layer doesn't look like any fabric has been turned up to create a hem. It's definitely frayed, but we do see this little strip running along the hem of this outer layer all the way around the skirt. And to me, it almost looks like a little glue strip running along, and so it would kind of keep the fraying from going further than that. It has some space that it will fray and stuff, but at that glue strip, it stops fraying. So that's kind of my theory of what might be going on with this hem. Who knows what they actually used, but here are the pictures that kind of show that hem. And then looking at the nylon layer, it does look like there's actually a little hem. It almost looks like it's just turned up once and only about an 1/8 inch. And then I was horrified to think that it might have been hand sewn in place. It almost looks like a little whip stitch securing that little hem. But to my relief, it almost looks like it's actually a little zigzag stitch or some sort of hemming stitch. It's just too even and perfect, possibly to be hand stitched. It just looks like a machine could easily have done that and kept it in place. Who knows, maybe they were crazy enough to hem the whole thing by hand. But I'm relieved to know that I could probably replicate it with a little zigzag type stitch. Lastly, for the 2 YUMISSIMA fabric, say that 10 times, the hem on those again doesn't look like any fabric has been turned up to create a hem. It almost looks like it's just kind of melted maybe to keep it from fraying. There's definitely no turn to it, so who knows what happened there, but I'm guessing it was either melted or a little glue strip along the end, something like that. So now another key aspect to this dress is the 10,000 Swarovski crystals, which were hand applied to the skirts. So this is something that is completely believable as far as getting 10,000 on the skirt layer. On my replicas, I never reached an actual 10,000 crystals on the outer layer of the skirt, but I got close a few times and knew I never wanted to do it again. That doesn't make sense, but you know me. But a lot of crystals can fit on that skirt. And if we look up close, they seem to vary in sizes. There's some larger ones, but then we also see these little tiny ones. So kind of just a combination of sizes, and they are randomly placed. Oh, and a pretty obvious detail of the skirt, but I probably should mention it because we're talking about all the little details, is that the skirt is gathered and it's not very tightly gathered, which is actually a very good point to be made, because this means that the skirt is probably not a long rectangle piece of fabric just gathered up at the waist and then you have a nice full skirt. Because in order to do that and get the huge circumference of the skirt, you would need a very, very, very tightly gathered waistband to contain all that skirt. So I think it's gourd shaped panels for the skirt, and that would help with the not so tightly gathered waistband. I totally forgot that I came across this picture a few years ago on Instagram. It is posted on a photographer's page, and a couple, I don't remember how long it was, later, this picture came up on Instagram. What we see here is incredible. So first off, we see this incredible flare in the air of the top skirt going onto the dress form. But if we notice, there's already the iridescent nylon layer. So this means that the top 3 layers of the skirt are separate from the nylon layer. So this would really help with the gathering of the waistband. So instead of having all 5 to 6 layers of the skirt gathered in one, there seems to be only the 3 top layers of the fabric, which is the silk crepe line and 2 layers of YUMISSIMA. So those 3 fabrics are very fine. And so gathering those would be quite easy and really delicate looking. And so if we look at her waistband, we can see that. So it kind of all makes sense now. The top 3 layers of the skirt are gathered together, and then there's the next layer of the iridescent nylon. So I don't know if this layer is connected to the other 2 layers of white that I mentioned earlier, but anyway, we do see that the nylon layer is separate from the outer layers. I want to take this time to give a huge shout out to Kathy K.D., who is the source of all these incredible close-up pictures of the skirt and later on for the bodice as well. She has a full album of high-resolution pictures of the Cinderella dress, as well as other costumes from the movie. So definitely check out that link down below to her full album. You can download them, and I would recommend crediting her because you don't get high-resolution pictures of costumes very often. And so these are like incredibly high-res. So if you're interested, that link is down below. Again, thank you, Kathy, for these amazing pictures and for sharing them online. And now we can finally move on to the bodice for this dress. So first and foremost, the first look of the bodice is an obvious, completely smooth, just glorious bodice. It's so smooth. And if we look closer at the waistline of her bodice, we can see that it actually doesn't end at her waistline. We see the bodice go in to her waistline and then it goes out a little bit and then ends. This adds a unique challenge to the fit of the bodice because you now have to make the fabric stretch in and then stretch out without wrinkling. So definitely a challenge when they constructed it that way. It's a really unique design. So again, it doesn't end at the waistline, it goes a little bit past her waistline because you can see the bodice go like this. The front of the bodice has a point at the bottom as well as the back. And if we look at the back of the bodice, it definitely has a fairly low back and it has a nice V-shape to it. Looking at the front of the bodice, it almost looks like a sweetheart-shaped neckline, kind of like this, but we don't really know for sure because the poofy Bertha is kind of covering up the shape of the neckline. If we look at this photo here of the promotional image, we do kind of see the backing shadow of a strap that runs along her shoulder or off her shoulder. I think this makes the most sense for bodice construction to have a thin strap that goes around the shoulders. This would help support the Bertha and just keep it all in place better. The closure of the bodice is at the back, and if we look at this photo closely, you can see the hooks and eyes. So a hooks and eye closure, which is my favorite. Another interesting detail about this bodice is the piping that runs along the bottom edge of the bodice, as well as around the armholes. And this is something that the color of the piping is slightly different than the bodice, which is interesting. I don't know if it's slightly a silvery color, a silvery blue maybe. It's hard to tell, but it's definitely a different shade than the main part of the bodice. Now, if we go on to look at what the fabric of the bodice might be, personally, I believe the only really way to achieve the look of the bodice fabric is to layer fabric. Layer multiple fabrics together to create the look of the bodice. Now, of course, I don't know if that's actually what they did, but I think that might be so, because if we look at this picture, we see some gathering of a sheer outer layer to the bodice. the shimmery, shiny bit of the bodice doesn't wrinkle. It's just an outer little sheer layer. So my theory is there's a supportive back layer to the bodice, and then a iridescent layer, and then a layer of the silk crepe line of the skirt, the same color and stuff on top of that shiny layer. This would help achieve the watercolor look of the skirt, because if you layer fabrics, again, like we've discovered, you get a nice watercolor result. So now that we've talked about the actual bodice, we can now go on to the main part of the bodice, and that's the Bertha. So based on this article that I mentioned earlier, they called the Bertha detachable. If you look at this photo here, you almost see a stiff, shiny edge. My theory is this is where the attachments between the Bertha and the bodice are. So you kind of have this base section to the Bertha, and then you've got the poofy stuff attached to that stiff bit. That's my theory anyway, but we do see that kind of stiff edge that separates the Bertha from the bodice. And so as I mentioned, it's shiny, and this could be covered with the same iridescent nylon as the skirt. And this actually explains some things, because if you look at these photos of the Bertha, there's a couple things you notice. First of all, you notice there's a layering look to the Bertha. You see the bluish layer and then a purpley layer, and really looking at it, it looks like the same type of layers as the skirt. So probably the silk crepe line and then the YUMISSIMA fabric underneath. But then we do see a couple spots that it looks like the iridescent nylon, but it's obviously not at the same level as the other fabric. It's a deeper shine to it. So my guess is this stiffer part of the Bertha underneath is covered in the iridescent nylon, and then you have the poofy bits of the other layers of the Bertha on top. And so you just get sometimes the shimmer of the iridescent nylon in that Bertha. So again, going back to the layers of the outer part of the Bertha, I'm guessing it's the same teal and purple YUMISSIMA fabric that was used in the skirt, and then an outer layer of the blue silk crepe line. The Bertha itself is pretty poofy, and then you've got these sections where it's kind of twisted and tacked, so it kind of adds some dimension and twist to the Bertha. Now that we've talked about the Bertha, we now need to talk about what's on the Bertha, and that's the butterflies. So we're told that the butterflies are handmade, which makes sense because, you know, details. But the butterflies are really pretty, and the majority of them are blue. We do see a couple aqua-y teal butterflies, and then we also see yellow. And the designs of the butterflies kind of vary. I never really have seen the same butterfly in a different spot. I'm guessing they're all unique and different, who knows? But they're made up of a combination of the iridescent nylon, feathers, zigzaggy looking thing fabric, and organza. There's just a lot of different things in the butterflies, and some use all the different fabrics, some use a couple of them, some just use feathers. It's really just a mixture of techniques. Another characteristic of the butterflies is it seems like they're all somewhat painted with the design, and then they all have crystals placed somewhere on the butterflies. Some are on the body of the butterflies, others are along the wings. It's just, again, a mixture of design technique. And then I recently came across this picture of the butterflies. They are the butterflies used on Cinderella's ball gown, and you get a nice view flat of the butterflies, which is great. So with that, this costume study of Cinderella's ball gown is complete and finished. So much information in this. So much. There's so many details added in this ball gown. It's so simple in its look and its elegance, but it's so complexly and detailed in its design. So I hope you enjoyed this little process. And before we close out this video, let's just look at the beauty of this costume for just a minute or so. So again, you can download my little compilation of all the different details of this dress and the possible fabrics that were used for each part of the dress. You can find that in the link below, and then also it should pop up. But again, you can find that, and a huge shout out to all the people that have taken these photos for us to look at for replicating this ball gown and really discovering the details. I am so looking forward to making my 6th one. Yes, there are going to be challenges along the way, but I am so excited to take you all along on this in-depth Cinderella making process. This is definitely my most requested videos. It's the one that I get the most questions about, how I made it, what patterns I used, and all that. And so I'm finally able to share all that information with you guys, which I'm very excited. So with that, thank you for watching, and a huge thank you to my patrons who are making this project possible. I first opened my Patreon account because of this dress. I wanted to make it, but it is a very expensive process, and because of the patrons that have chosen to support me, I am able to do this for all of you. So if you want to be a part of that, you can find the link down below. And as always, now go out into your own sewing area and learn, create, and inspire. And I'll see you next week.